This episode is brought to you in part by the Table Podcast from the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm Darrell Bach, one of the hosts, and I invite you to join us as we discuss issues of God and culture, which includes anything and everything. Listen on your podcast app or at dts.edu/thetable.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. It can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of Season 6. The first episode in the series is called What is Biblical? This one is Francis Schaeffer. Today on the show, world travel, fundamentalism, fear, best-selling books, and lederhosen. We have a special guest to guide you through this topic.
I'm Barry Hankins, a professor of history at Baylor University, where I've been for going on 28 years.
He's the author of several books, including one on Woodrow Wilson, another on J. Frank Norris, a history of Southern Baptists. But today, we're talking to him about Francis Schaeffer and the shaping of evangelical America. Schaeffer became a favorite theologian for the religious right and plays a key role in this season. But first, the basic biography.
Francis Schaeffer grew up in Germantown, Pennsylvania, which is kind of a suburb of Philadelphia.
Working class family, born in 1912.
They attended a mainline Presbyterian church, but the way Schaeffer tells the story is that his family really wasn't very religious. They were not very devout. Had a conversion experience when he was about 17. Of course, he's the source of most of what we know about his early life, and so even in the book where I'm covering his early life, I'm relying a lot on his own recollection. And this is an unlikely story, but this is the way he would tell it. He was going to church, and he had a Sunday school teacher who wanted him to help teach English to a Russian immigrant. He went to a bookstore to buy a book that would help him teach English to a Russian immigrant. And somehow he ended up going home with a book on ancient Greek philosophy.
As one does.
He started reading it, and it sort of captured his imagination because he liked the questions that the ancient Greeks were asking and trying to answer in their philosophy. And of course, later on, he's reading his fundamentalism back into his teens, because he's saying that by contrast to the ancient Greeks he started reading about, he was not getting very good questions at his mainline Presbyterian church and not getting very good answers for how to live one's life. Of course, this is a standard evangelical fundamentalist critique of mainline Protestantism, liberal Protestantism.
Remember, mainline generally refers to theologically liberal churches. They may or may not believe in the miracles, that Jesus is the only way to God, might try to downplay or toss out parts of the Bible, that kind of stuff.
And so he began to read this. He found the questions that the ancient Greeks would ask very interesting and profound about how to live one's life, but he didn't find their answers very satisfying. So he started reading the Bible more, and he started finding the answers in the Bible that he was looking for. And he thought the Bible was more coherent and made more sense in its answers to life's big questions.
That's going to play in later. He goes looking for answers to big questions, and then he attends a tent revival, hears the gospel, dedicates his life to Christ.
So Schaeffer, after his conversion experience, he went to Drexel Institute, which is now Drexel University. His father wanted him to be, an engineer or something like that. Through the influence of a Sunday school teacher, he really decided that he wanted to go into the ministry, and he felt that he was being called to the ministry.
He dives into reading J. Gresham Machen, a name you might remember from last season, when Harry Emerson Fosdick wrote his famous sermon that kicked off the modernist fundamentalist debate. Machen was one of the guys who responded in the newspapers.
Schaeffer encountered Machen's writings and apparently read Machen's classic book from 1923, Christianity and Liberalism.
In the process, Francis met his wife at an unlikely place for a budding fundamentalist, in a mainline youth gathering. According to Edith, his future wife,
at the end of this meeting, Schaeffer stood up and took on the speaker, the liberal speaker, and sort of tried to refute what the speaker had taught that evening. And then Edith stood up and did the same thing, and they both had read Machen. They were using Machen's arguments against theological liberalism. When Schaeffer stood up, Edith, elbowed her friend next to her and said, "Who is that?" And her friend said, "That's Francis Schaeffer. He goes by Fran." And then when Edith stood up, Schaeffer elbowed his friend and said, "Who is that?" And his friend said, "That's Edith Seville." And so afterward they met and started dating. And so they're dating from the beginning. They would have dates where they actually would discuss J. Gresham Machen's theology.
I mean, it's kind of cute, I guess. Schaeffer transferred to Hampton-Sydney College, preparing for ministry. He graduated, and the next logical step.
Westminster is a no-brainer choice for him for seminary because, of course, Machen founded that seminary when Machen split off from Machen and a bunch of cohorts split away from Princeton. And he studies there for 2 years, and then there's a split at Westminster. And he leaves Westminster in Philadelphia, and he goes with the group that splits off, which is led by mostly Carl McIntyre and a guy named Alan McRae. And Schaeffer goes with them. They founded Faith Seminary and also started a new Presbyterian denomination called the Bible Presbyterian Denomination. And so Schaeffer was, and again, this could be some retroactive history after Schaeffer became famous, but Schaeffer was known as the first student at Faith Seminary and as the first minister ordained in the Bible Presbyterian Church. Again, they may have done a little revisionist history there to get a later famous Schaeffer as the first in both of those categories. I've always been a little dubious of that claim.
While at Westminster, he studied under Cornelius Van Til, one of the big influences on R.J. Rushdoony. Patrons of the show can listen to a special bonus episode that talks about the connections between Schaeffer and Rushdoony. But we've got a long way to go. Notice here the fundamentalist desire to split and split and split again, finding enemies within Christianity. It's something that Carl McIntyre, one of Schaeffer's mentors at the time, was really good at. At this stage, fundamentalists like him were caught up in the idea of separatism. Essentially, real Christians stay away from theologically liberal churches and their congregations. You could also go so far as to say that they had to separate from other Bible-believing Christians who wouldn't separate. There was also a devotion to the subculture and avoiding worldly things. The first section of his ministry was like this, tied up in debates within branches of Christianity. After seminary, he pastored some churches, and then, in the late 1940s, things changed, just as World War II ended.
In 1947, the Independent Board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions, which was this missionary organization founded by Machen, but it went with the McIntyre group when the split came in the 30s. They wanted to start doing work in Europe now that the war was over. And what they wanted to do was really try and plant American fundamentalism, Protestant fundamentalism, in post-war Europe.
Sort of a fundamentalist Marshall Plan. Now that the continent was recovering from that terrible conflict, why not minister to people there? Schaeffer was chosen to do the reconnaissance. He toured all over Europe, meeting groups of like-minded fundamentalists.
And so when Schaeffer got back, he made his report. Then this mission board asked him if he would go be a full-time missionary in Europe. So in 1948, I think it was, he and Edith and the three daughters, they moved to Switzerland and started their work there in Europe. And of course, he would be there, essentially live there the rest of his life, although he would spend a lot of time in the United States as well from the mid-60s on.
Francis Schaeffer was once one of the biggest names in evangelicalism. Even if you don't recognize his name, you can still probably feel his influence. This is the story of a fundamentalist who turns his back on fundamentalism, then embraces a new version of it, and provides the theological backbone for a form of Christian nationalism. Through his writings, tapes, and films, Schaeffer is going to inspire, and then to spread fear about the decline of civilization. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starrin, and this is Truths. Moving to Europe marks a major shift in Francis Schaeffer's ministry.
What happened is that when he got to Europe, he starts encountering a secular culture. He started running into people. They weren't liberal Christians. They weren't Christians at all. And they didn't really know much about the Christian faith. And all of a sudden, he started realizing that all this infighting that the McIntyre brand of fundamentalists were engaged in, where they were doing most of their refuting of fellow Christians, and most of their arguments were aimed at Christians to come out from another Christian group and be real fundamentalists. And in Europe, Schaeffer really developed this idea. His energy would be better spent trying to persuade people of the coherence of the Christian faith. So he wants to do what he experienced in his own teens, in that he wants to spread the Bible's answers about the meaning of life to people who are not believers at all. And to do that, when he started to do that, all of this fighting about who's separating from whom and who's theologically correct within American evangelicalism it was like a waste of time to him.
A considerable change, considering he was sent there to spread fundamentalism. His ministry shifted to how he could reach people in an increasingly post-Christian Europe.
And he has this complete falling out, which means he and Edith, now they don't have any more funding from the mission board. And so they had to start raising their own funding. This break from the Presbyterian Mission Board opened up the way for the founding of L'Abri in Switzerland.
And the second chapter of his ministry. They just needed somewhere to do it.
You cannot talk about L'Abri, and in fact, you cannot talk about Francis Schaeffer without talking about Edith.
She came from a wealthy, refined family.
She knew about art and she knew about literature. And really, it's her influence that got him to think about how Christianity might relate to the arts. And then when he went to Europe, even that first trip in the summer of 47 or 48, he went to the Louvre in Paris, and he saw things and artworks that he had, and it just made him think. So once they're out from under the Presbyterian Mission Board, they start raising their own funding, and they developed a vision for a place where they could just invite young people to come and talk about things, about life. But she found this chalet in this town further up the mountains called Weymouth. And she goes up there and she negotiates and she works all of this up and then comes back and sort of lays it on the table in front of Francis. So they bought this chalet and they moved up there and they started L'Abri.
The ministry flourished. The place became a stopping point for people on a spiritual tour of Europe and Asia. Followers of Timothy O'Leary, who advocated LSD, young people influenced by Nietzsche, wanderers, pilgrims, theological students, everyone was welcome to come and discuss. Their chats became legend, and soon they circulated audio cassettes of the discussion. Schaeffer toured giving lectures. Those lectures would then be turned into books, which were also widely circulated. So different from his fundamentalist days as a young man. Instead of being afraid of the culture, he talked about movies, books, music, art, philosophy, everything, in order to promote the gospel, while also wearing lederhosen. But also, Schaeffer came up with the ideas that would make him famous.
He starts to develop this overarching argument for the compellingness and the coherence of the Christian worldview. And as he does that, he develops this overarching critique of Western thought, Western civilization's thought, sort of from the Greeks through the Enlightenment.
This grand narrative did some heavy lifting. One of the ideas that was becoming popular in Schaeffer's day was relativism. He calls it secular humanism. It's essentially the idea that what is true for one person may not be true for another. You can have your truth, and I'll have mine. This makes life complicated for evangelicals who argue that there is just one God, and such a thing as good and evil. Schaeffer does his best to track secular humanism back through history. And he says it began with Thomas Aquinas, an Italian friar, priest, and writer in the 1200s.
And I'm smiling because any philosopher of Aquinas will tell you that Schaeffer gets Aquinas completely wrong, but the argument is that Aquinas split faith and reason.
Okay, so what does it mean to split faith and reason? If you've ever read something like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, you're probably familiar with the idea that a person can use logic and reason to arrive at faith. Schaeffer believed that hundreds of years ago, humans started to separate reason from faith, and he wrongly pegged Aquinas as the guy who started the trend. Schaeffer's argument then circles around three areas you might remember from history class. Three kind of broad, centuries-long, nebulous movements that are a little hard to summarize: the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. First, the Renaissance. We're talking basically the 1300s to the 1600s. Europe's coming out of the Middle Ages, what some people call the Dark Ages. There's a rebirth of interest in classical art, literature, and philosophy, rediscovering the Greeks and the Romans. Some of this is driven by the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. There was also this notion of humanism, or that man was the center of the universe. Schaeffer argues that this era lost its focus on God, but that too is misleading, because there were different movements in the Renaissance. The Renaissance of northern Italy was largely Christian, but that distinction was lost on Francis. Also, to my mind, to say that Western thought went bad in the 1300s is like saying the Middle Ages were the good old days. And let me say emphatically, they were not. Okay, end of rant. That, in a nutshell, was the Renaissance. The Reformation was kicked off in the early 1500s as Protestant Christianity pushed back against the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church. This is where guys like Martin Luther come into play. It was a massive correction of power. Schaeffer loved this era.
Somehow the Reformation is all good because the Reformation, Calvin and Luther, the classical reformers, were able to bring these things back together.
Make arriving at faith reasonable again. Schaeffer thinks things are great in this era. People are refocused on the Bible and they throw off the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church. Then came the Enlightenment, which took place from roughly the late 1600s to the early 1800s. A time focused on reason and questioning authority. Where do leaders get their power? Is it from God or from the will of the people? The American and French revolutions were both wrapped up in Enlightenment ideas. Schaeffer largely frowned on this era because he thought it continued to try and separate reason from God.
And you end up with a modern worldview that says the only way that you can actually be a Christian is to make a leap of faith, a leap outside of reason. In fact, he writes a book called Escape from Reason. And Schaeffer wants to argue against that. What he wants to argue, what he begins to argue at L'Abri all the way through the mid-60s, and then his books start coming out in the late 60s and early 70s, he argues that there is no need for a leap of faith to be a Christian. Obviously, you need faith. You need saving faith. He's a classical Protestant in that view. But it's not a leap out of your rationality because reason and faith can be integrated, and in fact were, before the sort of development of the modern world separated them. So he begins to argue that it is not only reasonable to be a Christian, but that Christianity is the only coherently rational answer to life's questions that can bring meaning. All of the other views, Enlightenment, Renaissance views, whatever, 19th century philosophers, whether it be Hegel or Kierkegaard, one who was a Christian, one who was not, but both have this problem in Schaeffer's view that they separated reason and faith. And so they were in error in doing that and didn't need to do that. And Schaeffer wants to show the Christian faith is the only reasonable approach that's coherent to life.
3 eras, each new one informed by the last. To really oversimplify things for Francis, it was in order: Renaissance bad, Reformation good, Enlightenment bad. In a way, this oversimplification makes sense, right? In Switzerland, the Schaeffers find themselves in the middle of this circuit where people are looking for answers. Some of them get wrapped up in drugs, sex, music, politics, and counterculture. A generation on the search for meaning. It's kind of understandable that Schaeffer, a Bible-believing Christian, wants to address this issue. He does it by trying to trace changes in philosophy that created this hungry generation in the first place. And he points a finger at the idea that people feel lost because society has given up on God.
For Schaeffer, this was the culmination of this split that he saw starting with Aquinas, going through the Renaissance, culminating in the Enlightenment. And what you end up with is modern relativism, where there is no transcendent truth, there is no transcendent morality. He doesn't coin the term, but he begins to popularize the term secular humanism. For him, this relativistic worldview is modern 20th century secular humanism.
Schaeffer meets this cultural moment. As a young man, he was frustrated that church leaders couldn't offer answers to big questions. Now he has answers in the form of this big arching idea of history. Thoughts that include philosophies of Kierkegaard, Kant, and Nietzsche. Renaissance bad, Reformation good, Enlightenment bad. There was just one little problem.
One of my sources lived at L'Abri for 5 years. And he told me in his interview that in the 5 years he lived with Francis and Edith Schaeffer, he never saw Schaeffer read a book other than the Bible. And Edith says this in her books, and Frankie, their son, Frank goes by Frank now, Frank says this in his recent books, that their dad read magazines. And so what Schaeffer learned about intellectual history and art, he learned by reading articles in magazines. And so he became a sort of synthesizer of a lot of journalism, some of which was probably pretty good, but he certainly never read Aquinas.
There are a bunch of holes in his timeline in philosophy over the years, and I can't cover them all. But here's a couple. Like that accusation that Aquinas tried to split reason and faith. No. Or that the Renaissance and Reformation were two distinct eras. No. One inspired the other, and they kind of bled into each other. In one of his films, he botched the meaning of Michelangelo's David. He bungles Kant and Kierkegaard. There are plenty of mistakes in his work, which makes his writing a little shaky. Not useless by any stretch of the imagination, but he was able to take stuff out of context to build his cohesive worldview. That'll become an issue in a few minutes.
So yes, he had a superficial sort of knowledge of the things he was writing about, but he still wrote about them in ways that could be very, very helpful. I'll give you a good analogy that's in the book, and it comes from George Marsden,
a historian who appeared last season on this show. Marsden was at Calvin College when Schaeffer made one of his first lectures in the United States after having been gone for a long time.
Marsden wrote that listening to Schaeffer talk about intellectual history was kind of like watching somebody sketch a map of the world, where once the person got done, if they were pretty good, you could kind of tell, well, this is the continent of Africa, and this is Asia, and this is the Pacific Ocean, and this is the Atlantic Ocean, this is North America. But you wouldn't have any of the details there. You wouldn't know where Boston was, or even the United States necessarily. So he characterized Schaeffer's lectures like that. Well, those lectures are what became his books. So he's sort of roughing in a very sketchy picture of something that has a certain coherency to it, especially when he gets from the Enlightenment on. But it is a sort of at a superficial level that he's doing that.
When we return, Francis Schaeffer turns his attention to the United States. His superficial outline of world philosophy takes a turn towards Christian nationalism. While you listen to the ads, take a moment to leave a 5-star review of the show on your podcasting app. It helps others find the show. Okay, here we go. I had the nicest comment come in via Patreon a few days ago from Karen. I'm going to read it for you. Truce is absolutely my go-to source on information and analysis to understand how the Christian church has become so divided and divisive. What a treasure trove of insightful, impactful information. I've used it as a springboard for many discussions. In Chris Staren's able hands, I know I will get a compassionate but unbiased look at where we've been and where that leads us. I am happy to support Chris's work to make us more knowledgeable about the roots of our faith at this critical juncture in time. Boy, it's hard to find words after receiving something like that. Thank you so much, Karen. This show really means something to listeners around the world, which is just amazing. If you want to be a part of what's happening with Truce, take this time to do 2 things for me. 1, tell a friend by texting, calling, emailing, or going on social media. And 2, consider giving a little each month to help me finance this show. I still need about 160 people to sign up to give $10 a month in order to meet my goal. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to learn how. That's trucepodcast.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Welcome back. Today, we're talking about Francis Schaeffer.
So Schaeffer starts developing all the things we've been talking about from the early 50s through the mid-60s. And students, Christian college students, began to hear about L'Abri, and they began to want to go there. So in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a 5-year period where Schaeffer never even came back to the United States at all. But through these Christian college students who started going to L'Abri, they started going back and they would tell people about it. So Schaeffer got invited first to Boston to speak to an evangelical student organization, and he gives his talk there. And then he gets invited to places like Wheaton and Calvin, and then it's Westmont. When I interviewed some of the people who were there, one of them made the point that he's talking about art history, and he had gotten into movies. And again, I don't think he watched a lot of these movies. I think he read reviews of them. And so he was critiquing mid-60s movies. So in the mid-60s, you have these films that are coming out that are pretty out there, and he's talking about what's the meaning of this film. And of course, it fits right in with his sort of secularization thesis and how reason has been split from faith, and this film is doing that and so forth. And he's doing this at Wheaton at a time when Wheaton students were not allowed to go to movies, And so the point that I make in the book is that he's talking about stuff on Christian college campuses. Christian college campuses are really they still have a hangover from fundamentalism, is the way I put it. And the hangover is you're supposed to separate yourself from the world. You're not supposed to talk about movies. You're supposed to not go to them. You're not supposed to talk about rock and roll music. You're supposed to abstain from listening to it. And Schaeffer comes and he's doing these lectures about art. He's talking about rock and roll. He's talking about these things. And so there was this hunger for this within American evangelicalism. It's mostly Northern evangelicalism. It's kind of that neo-evangelical world of Wheaton and Calvin and Gordon College and Westmont and in these places. And so the students, they're just eating this stuff up because they are intellectually curious and they're Christians and they have grown up in churches that just have not put the two together, And so this becomes Schaeffer's contribution. It really is the idea that intellectual life can be integrated with evangelical faith. In fact, the whole project of being an evangelical Christian should be about developing a Christian worldview that is a reasonable and faith-driven approach to the Christian life. That integration is Schaeffer's project from, again, the mid-50s and even into the late 70s. And so when the books start coming out, they just sell by the tens of thousands.
If you grew up in the 1990s like I did, the worldview component was everywhere. We were told that Christians have to have a complete, assembled, cohesive view of everything from politics to entertainment. If you remember, Schaeffer came onto the world stage when separatism was still a big idea. Carl McIntyre's style of fundamentalism where we stay out of the culture and hunker down in our subculture. Then comes Schaeffer, who ties in not only modern references, but great works of art and philosophy. He even has a lecture about Christian environmentalism. But things are about to change.
And it would have been hard, even maybe until the late 70s, to pinpoint Schaeffer politically. But something happens, and it's in conjunction with his first film, and it's in conjunction with some relationships that he developed with Republicans. When he did the first film, How Should We Then Live? It's always hard to get the title right.
It comes out in the United States in 1977, and there's a companion book with the same title.
When I read that, I began to notice something different. In his other books, he had been critiquing secular humanism. In his book, How Should We Then Live? And in the film, there's a subtle shift, and he starts to talk about secular humanists, individual people who are secular humanists. And it goes from a sort of amorphous philosophy that's at war with Christianity to a group of people who are at war with Christianity. In other words, there's an identifiable enemy out there. What does this sound like? I mean, this sounds like his fundamentalism of his early years as a Christian. It sounds like McIntyre. We've identified the enemy, and it's really, really important that we do that, and we call out the enemy, and then we keep ourselves separate from the enemy. It's not pervasive at first, but it is a subtle shift that you begin to see.
That switch is important, defining an enemy, because Schaeffer is no longer just some guy living in a chalet in Switzerland. His tapes, books, and movies are spreading through the subculture.
Probably by the late 70s, other than Billy Graham, he and Edith, they probably are the most well-known evangelicals in America. In fact, in the early 80s, Newsweek magazine religion editor writes an article about Schaeffer, and he calls him the guru of fundamentalism in America. So Schaeffer is starting to move in the elite circles of American evangelicalism, which means he is meeting some key Republican figures, and they want to meet him because he's influencing them. And they're either reading his books or going to a lecture or hearing about a lecture and so forth. So he meets Republican figures like Jack Kemp, the conservative Republican from upstate New York. Edith begins to meet some of them, and they start to travel in these sort of elite Washington, D.C. circles of evangelical Republicans, and this is going to have an influence on Schaeffer as well.
D. James Kennedy, Pat Robertson, Richard Land, Jerry Falwell, Chuck Colson, Michelle Bachmann, Tim LaHaye, and David Barton all read Schaeffer. His film, How Should We Then Live?, was funded in part by Richard DeVos, founder of the Amway multi-level marketing company. Francis was well connected to this group of usual suspects. According to Professor Hankins, it was Francis's son, then called Frankie, now known as Frank, who set him in the direction of the third act of his life, as a Republican advocate, providing the theological backing for the religious right. It began with their shared film projects. Francis had been talking about retiring around 1974.
So Frank at this time is 22 years old, and he's an aspiring filmmaker and artist. And he grew up at L'Abri. There are just a myriad of stories of him growing up as a kid at L'Abri, that some of which are just hysterical. He tells them himself in his memoir, Crazy for God.
On tours of the U.S. college campuses where his father was speaking, he tried to seduce co-eds, made long-distance calls, and once threw pies across a ballroom, Frisbee style. In the 1990s, he wrote loosely biographical novels accusing his father of being moody. He now produces conspiratorial videos online, which is why he's not a guest on this episode. But at the time, he too was a fundamentalist. Father and son worked together on a film series and a book by the same title, How Should We Then Live? Here, Francis crosses into the place of advocating for culture wars. He uses existing fears that were already widespread in evangelicalism and then leans into them. Stuff like communism, nuclear war, inflation, and the fear of authoritarianism. In episode 10, he asserts that authoritarianism will come when mankind will do anything to keep their comfort and peace and to avoid war. He says there are two options.
One, an imposed order. And we spent a long time about the possibility of this imposed order. Or, in the natural flow of things, just one other alternative. And that is that our society would affirm the base that gave us the form and freedoms in the first place. That is a return to God's revelation in the Bible and as he has revealed himself in Christ. This was the base that gave us the forms and the freedoms.
Out of context, that may seem like a lot. But by this point, he spent hours laying out this broad argument. This is where all of that Renaissance bad, Reformation good, Enlightenment bad stuff comes together. Schaeffer argues that the Founding Fathers didn't get their motivation from the Enlightenment, which was bad, but from the Reformation, which was good because men had turned back to God. That was the American Revolution. In the French Revolution, remember that from last season? People rejected God because the French Revolution's ideas came from the Enlightenment. That's such an oversimplification that it really is tempting to call it nonsense. Both the American and the French Revolutions were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. By pegging the American Revolution on the Reformation, he gives it a sheen of Christianity. By his logic, if the Founding Fathers like Jefferson were inspired by the Reformation, there was a Christian ethos to the founding of the nation. Therefore, our freedoms are from the Reformation, not the big bad Enlightenment. He advocates for liberties in a strange way. He does it while also undercutting democracy, the tyranny of the majority, here called the 51%. A neat and also troubling trick. Listen for it.
Well, there's the possibility of the total dominance of the 51% vote. Now remember, it was Christianity, the Reformation Christianity in the north of Europe, that brought forth the forms and the freedoms which we have, the 51% vote. But I'm talking about the 51% vote after there is no absolute by which to judge the 51% vote. There was a time in the days when the Christian culture was more dominant, when the lone individual could stand up with the Bible in his hand and say, "You're wrong," even though the majority has voted the other way. But as the Christian consensus is gone, then there is no absolute by which to judge the 51%. And then this is a very, very different situation.
He both praises the liberties that he says were established in the Reformation, and then calls them into question unless they can be compared to the Bible. You see that? It's the seeds of Christian nationalism. We love and will fight for liberties, as long as they're being used in Christian ways. That's why that whole thing about the Reformation and Renaissance was important. Because by labeling the American Revolution as a product of the Reformation, when the Bible and God were at the center of authority, he gives the Founding Fathers the sheen of being Christian followers, even though they were not. And he sells it in a package of fear that the only way to fight authoritarianism is by restoring a Christian ethos to the nation.
If we're going to live and escape death, not only death individually in the sense of the judgment of God, but death in our culture, in our political life, in our present life, we must turn from that humanist way of making man autonomous, and we must put the Creator at the center of all things.
He's entering the culture wars, calling Christians to influence the society or else allow the country to slip into authoritarianism. This was not a new maneuver. We saw this a bunch in Season 3 when discussing the 1950s and how fear of communism impacted evangelicals. But it is an updated take. Are you fired up yet? Well, buckle in for some more. How Should We Then Live was not his only combination book and film release. A few years later came Whatever Happened to the Human Race, also created by his son, Frankie.
Frankie, aspiring filmmaker and artist, got into the abortion issue. His girlfriend became pregnant in their relationship. They got married. For some reason, he started to think about Roe v. Wade, which was 1973. And this becomes a sort of an existential thing for him. He starts to think about, maybe they even considered abortion. I don't know. But he started to think about, what if we had aborted our child? And so he starts to get into the abortion issue. And he starts to badger his dad, Francis, about making a film about abortion. They hook up with C. Everett Koop,
a doctor and future Surgeon General under Ronald Reagan. Years earlier, Coop had treated Schaeffer's daughter, and they became friends. He shared Frankie's concerns about abortion and euthanasia.
And they start to make the film, Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And that film begins to catch on with evangelicals as well.
The movie certainly was not the start of the pro-life movement. It came out in 1979, years after the National Women's Conference, where people like Lottie Beth Hobbs spoke, as well as Nellie Gray, founder of the March for Life, and Dr. Mildred Jefferson, founder of the National Right to Life. And even before that, for years they'd been marching on Washington, D.C. Protestants were not the driving force in the early days of the pro-life movement.
The early pro-life movement in the late 60s and running through 1973 and the Roe v. Wade decision was really a Catholic movement. And a lot of Catholic Democrats, politicians who later would become pro-choice, were actually part of that early pro-life movement. It starts to catch on in evangelicalism in the mid-70s, but at first, a lot of evangelicals and even fundamentalists are like, we just don't, that's a Catholic thing, and we're not into it. They're just not paying attention to it. I think the role that the film played, and I can't show this with statistics or sociological studies or anything, but I think the role the film plays is to help bring evangelicals into the pro-life movement in a pervasive sort of way. It really popularized the pro-life movement amongst evangelicals.
He brings a lot of this together in his book, A Christian Manifesto.
A Christian Manifesto, the book, was sort of written by a lawyer named John Whitehead, who has an institute in Virginia called the Rutherford Institute. Frank and Francis, they wrote up a bunch of notes. So it was a joint project, to be sure. The cover of the book probably should be A Christian Manifesto, Francis Schaeffer with John Whitehead or something like that,
In the book, they pick up what Schaeffer's been talking about since How Should We Then Live? Picking a fight with secular humanists.
He begins to say that what secular humanists in America are attacking politically is the Christian base on which America was founded. So basically what he's arguing is it doesn't need to be the case that every single founding father was a Christian. He sort of avoids that trap because he knows Jefferson's an infidel, that Jefferson's at best a deist, But he does argue that most of them were Christians.
And just a reminder from season 3, that is not the case.
And that they were, whether they knew it or not, they were working from a Christian base, a Christian worldview that existed at that time. And it was basically the idea that, good Republican government had to be founded on morality, and morality had to be founded on Christianity. And therefore, America does have this Christian foundation or base, as he called it. And in the late 20th century, when political liberals are wanting, to loosen up the laws of America to recognize everyone's individual right to live as they want to live, Schaeffer sees this as moving away from this Christian base. So in A Christian Manifesto, he takes the argument the next step, basically saying that we're very near a time when Christians are going to be so much under attack that we may need to start engaging in civil disobedience against the government. It's a pretty radical argument at this time, but that's the manifesto of it. And that manifesto becomes very influential with figures like Jerry Falwell, who Schaeffer already had known for 4 or 5 years by the time the Christian Manifesto came out. All the key figures of the early Christian right in the 1980s have talked about Schaeffer's influence. And that book becomes something like a manifesto of the Christian right.
Schaeffer is tied up with the big players in fundamentalist and nationalist causes. He's got the back of the moral majority, even as he admits that their methods may not have been the best.
Back to Schaeffer's big project, he's trying to find, the history of this split between reason and faith. And of course, it really culminates in the Enlightenment. So he latches on to this Christian Enlightenment figure named Samuel Rutherford, Scottish figure. I don't know if he read Rutherford or he read about Rutherford, but he begins to get into Rutherford's sort of Christian Enlightenment thought. And then he begins to argue in a Christian manifesto that he's trying to argue the Founding Fathers are influenced more by a thoroughly Christian Enlightenment figure like Samuel Rutherford than they were by John Locke, who in some ways remained Christian, but in some ways could be viewed as a very unorthodox Christian for maybe his rejection of the Trinity or something like that. So Locke is part of the secular Enlightenment, Rutherford's part of the Christian Enlightenment, and so Schaeffer needs to tie Rutherford to the Founding Fathers. So you have this, but you have scholars like Mark Noll, who began his career writing about that era, that founding era, the late colonial revolution, and then the revolutionary, and then the early republic era of American history, religious history. And you have a figure like Mark Noll saying he can find almost no influence from Rutherford to the Founding Fathers. It just doesn't exist.
Rutherford was not an influence on the Founding Fathers of the United States. But that didn't stop Schaeffer and Whitehead, whose organization is called the Rutherford Institute, from making that argument in a Christian manifesto. A group of influential Christian historians entered the debate.
Hatch and Noll and George Marsden, they write a book that's basically an answer to a Christian manifesto, and which they basically say that Schaeffer's argument about the founding is just not right. Because the founding just wasn't that Christian the way Schaeffer makes it out to be in his argument leading up to and through the book A Christian Manifesto.
That may seem like a small thing, but it's vital. In Chapter 6 of the manifesto, Schaeffer depicted the Reagan election of 1980 as creating an open window in which evangelicals could influence the society. He simultaneously knocks the Supreme Court, an old chestnut we've seen before. Perhaps you can see why people on the religious right read his work and shared it. He not only confirmed their ideas that the United States was founded as a Christian country, and that they should be suspicious of the judicial branch, but he also called them to culture wars, even insisting that that was their Christian duty. And if you didn't, was Jesus really your Lord? Splitting groups of Christians in a way that fundamentalist Carl McIntyre would have been proud of. A Christian manifesto sold 290,000 copies in its first year, 62,000 of which went to Falwell's supporters and contributors. So, what is the legacy of Francis Schaeffer? First, he inspired a generation of thinkers, professors, and writers, uniting faith with intellectualism. Before Schaeffer, Christian leaders often called believers just to separate from the culture. Schaeffer urged believers to engage with it so as to better reach others. He inspired folks to think about their worldview, what a Christian should believe about politics, religion, media, and more. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, he helped to shape the evangelical subculture.
His other influence is in the development of the Christian right and in the development of the whole culture war approach to Christian politics in America. And so, as I said before, Jerry Falwell, had conversations. I mean, Schaeffer would ride places on Jerry Falwell's jet, and Falwell would say later how much he was influenced by Schaeffer. And then Southern Baptist conservatives, that I write about in another book, they grew up, there's just a small handful of them, but they grew up reading Francis Schaeffer. This was really unusual in the 70s to grow up reading, 70s or 80s, to grow up reading Francis Schaeffer if you're a Southern Baptist. He just hadn't penetrated the Southern Baptist world yet. There's a whole group now of Southern Baptists who become conservatives, and they become the leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, and some of them become culture warriors, and some of them are the most thoughtful of the culture warriors in American public life today.
Schaeffer had three distinct eras of his life. First as a fundamentalist, then as an evangelist/guru in Switzerland, and finally as a culture warrior. Each informed the other. He encouraged a generation to live consistently with their Christian walk, but also tied that walk to politics and the Reagan Revolution. He welcomed young people into his home, and then sold his ideas with fear. Schaeffer urged Christians to think in terms of art, philosophy, music, and culture, but also got a bunch of details wrong. He inspired decades of Christians to go into history and academia by not really doing his homework. Will he be remembered as an intellectual, an evangelist, or the man who provided the flawed theological backing for Christian nationalism? Special thanks to Barry Hankins for his help with this episode. If you're interested in Schaeffer, his book is a wonderful introduction. It's called Francis Schaeffer and the Shaping of Evangelical America. Thanks also to my friends Ben and Kenneth for having several different conversations about the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment, which helped me process all this data. This episode took a long time to make. By the time I recorded this episode, I've been thinking about this for 5 months. I recorded it on Christmas Day because I felt a cold coming and I didn't want my voice to give out. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate. There you can learn about supporting the show on Venmo, at Truce Podcast, Patreon, PayPal, and by old-fashioned check. Every little bit helps. And if you give on Patreon, you'll hear more with Barry Hankins and learn about R.J. Rushdoony's connection with Francis Schaeffer. This show really is just me. Friends chip in with their voices and web support, but someday I'd love to work with a team. There is no marketing staff, so it goes a long, long way when you recommend this show to your friends and family. Take a moment now to text them or post on social media, and maybe even write to your local newspaper, your favorite magazine, or podcaster, and let them know about this project. Truce is a production of Truce Media LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.